We were fearful that we might not have as many out today because of the ice and snow and it's cold and things like that, but we're glad that you have chosen to be with us today to worship together here with us. Today's lesson is going to be from a familiar passage that you're familiar with, but perhaps maybe not taken it this way before. So we're going to try to maybe think about this verse in a different way than what we have in the past. Loving your neighbor as yourself is the title of our lesson. It's taken from Matthew chapter 22, and we're going to start in verse 34. You'd like to read along with me? Please do. Jesus here speaking, and he's talking to this group of folks that are trying to trick him, as was common. And he starts here in verse 34, and it says, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, saying, 'Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?' Jesus said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment.' He goes on and says, 'And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments,' Jesus said, 'hang all the laws and prophets.'" Jesus was referring to here when he said, "Love your neighbor as yourself," an Old Testament Levitical text from Leviticus chapter 19. And really that whole chapter deals with this. But in particular, the beginning part of verse 13 says, "You shall not cheat your neighbor nor rob him." And then in verse 18 of that same passage in Leviticus, Jesus quotes this verse as well. "You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am your Lord." So Jesus is referring back to a verse that this lawyer would have been very well familiar with under that Levitical priesthood and Levitical law. And then we have another fellow that comes along and asks, "Well, all right, then, who is your neighbor? Is our neighbor just simply the guy that's right smack next door to us? Or is it the guy across the street or maybe down the road a ways?" Well, Jesus answers that question as well. And he does it here in Luke chapter 29, Luke chapter 10 and verse 29. And listen to what Jesus said. "But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?' Jesus answered that in that later on in text. And we'll come back to that here in just a moment. But it's not just simply the person who might live next door to us. Our neighbor is anyone who we might come in contact with. It may be at work, could be at school, it could be at any place we might frequent. That's who our neighbor is. Jesus refers to that. So a question is, how do you show love to your neighbor? Well, there's lots of ways, of course, and these are all good things. This kind of weather, you might shovel your neighbor's snow. Maybe they have a sidewalk that they need shoveled. Or in better weather, you might mow their grass. Nice things. And those certainly show love for your neighbor in this same sense of the word. You might rake their leaves. You might even maybe take a pot of soup over to them if they're sick or might could use something like that. Those are all wonderful things. But who was Jesus speaking about when he said, "Love your neighbor"? Well, it is more than just the person next door to us. It is people that we come in contact with. And what Jesus was saying is more than just soup. It's more than just shoveling someone's walk. It's more than just mowing someone's grass. It's more than just waving from afar, saying, "Hello, Joe, how you doing?" Those are all nice things. But what Jesus is referring to is something a little more deeper. Something deeper, and we'll get into that here in just a few moments. You might recall this fella. Remember Fred Rogers? He was the guy that hosted Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Now, I wasn't a fan of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I was more of a Bugs Bunny guy. But I did recall the show, and you probably do too. This guy was an interesting fellow. A lot of people made fun of him because of his little, his ways, a little bit weird. But Fred Rogers was actually a pretty interesting fellow. He was actually a Presbyterian minister. We won't get into his theology, of course, today. But he was a minister. He hosted this children's program for 33 years. He was on the air. And during his time on television, he won several awards for his show. And he did show compassion and love, if you will, to those that were part of his show and those that watched his show. But something interesting happened. In 1997, Mr. Rogers received this Lifetime Achievement Award. And he won this award, and he did something different during his acceptance speech. During his acceptance speech, he asked the audience to pause for 10 seconds. And he watched his watch. And he said, "During this time, I want you to think about people in your life who helped you get to where you are today." And he stood there and watched his watch tick, 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 tick away. The crowd is silent. This is a crowd of movie stars and popular people. They were dumbstruck by his actions. Mr. Rogers called us out at that point. Who has gotten you to the point to where you are today? And is that not what Jesus is asking us to consider when considering loving your neighbor? If you were to ask that of you, if we were to ask of that of you today, take 10 seconds right now and think of people who have gotten you to where you are today. Who would it be? Well, the first obvious one is my mom or my dad or my spouse. God should be first, of course. But who would be that in that list? Would I be in that list? Maybe. Some might say yes. This acceptance speech was something that touched the people's lives. Loving your neighbor is about touching the lives of your neighbor. It's not just simply waving from afar. It's not just simply shoveling their walk. Although those are all nice things. Whose lives are you making an impact on today? Maybe the answer to that question is nobody. I don't interact with people. They do their own thing. What happens to them happens to them. I couldn't care less. Is that your case today? Is that your situation in life today? That you look at those neighbors of yours. That is, those you come in contact with as, they get by however they get by. My job isn't to worry about that. My job is to keep my nose clean and let me take care of my stuff and let them worry about their own stuff. Is that your attitude today? It wasn't Fred Rogers for whatever that good that is. But more importantly, it wasn't what Jesus had in mind for us either. Today, I want us to explore these things. I want to show you some things about loving your neighbor, and that it goes further than soup. It goes further than being nice to people. Being nice is great. But what was the call of Jesus for us? It wasn't to be nice, even though that is good. But the call for us from Jesus is to what? To love. To love your neighbor, not just way from afar. Not just do a nice deed here and there. But Jesus' call for us was to love. How do we do that? Well, today I'm going to show you 5 ways and 5 reasons, I should say, to love your neighbor. And start to consider your love for your neighbor in a deeper way. Yes, soup is great. Shoveling walks is fine. But I want you to see what Jesus had in store for us. What Jesus had in mind for us was love, a sincere interest in their welfare. That goes beyond soup. That goes beyond niceties that we might offer. Think about reason 1 with me. One reason why we should love our neighbor. Well, okay, we're commanded to. Let's go home. We're done. Come forward as we stand and sing, right? Well, no, there's more to it than that. We are commanded. There's no question about that. And we see that from our text. Jesus said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So we know that that is a part of why we do what we do. But as a Christian, our love for our neighbor should go deeper than the niceties that we find and we see done. James says it this way: if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, you're allowed to love your neighbor as yourself. And when you do that, you do well. James had it right. In Romans chapter 15 and verse 2, said it this way: let each of us please his neighbor for his good, leading to edification. For even Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on him and me, Jesus is saying. Leaving and loving our neighbors. Jesus loved his neighbors, and it wasn't just a half-hearted, hello, how you doing? He got involved in their lives. Look at Matthew chapter 8. When he came down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, a leper came and worshiped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. A leper, which is probably one of the most contagious things you can touch. What did Jesus do? He put out his hand and touched him, saying, I'm willing, be cleansed. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Jesus didn't just love from afar. Hello, leper, get well someday. Hope you're getting better. He got down there and got into it and touched this man's leprosy so that it was cleansed. It's a command for you and I to love. And as a Christian, our love should go deeper. It should go beyond the surface love that we see from others. Reason number 2, we should love who God loves. Well, we do. Who do you see when you see someone in need? You see somebody who's in need. Who was some of the people that helped you along the way? Some of you might remember the name of Doug Roush. He was the minister at Fredericktown where I grew up as a late teen, early 20s. He was one of those that would put his arm around you and give you a hug when you needed it and a smack in the back of the head when you needed it too. That's what he gave me. And you know what? It's exactly what I needed. Who is it in your sphere or culture or neighborhood, if you will, that needs that same thing? They occasionally need a hug, and they occasionally need a swift kick. Perhaps there's somebody in your life that needs that. When we see that person in need, we should see opportunity rather than a problem. What do they need now? Oh, brother, here they go. Got their hand hung out, needing something. Instead of seeing it that way, a Christian would see it as an opportunity. We see that here from the parable that Jesus spoke, we talked about earlier. Jesus talks about the parable of the person on the road to Jericho, and the Good Samaritan. And a man went down from Jericho and fell among thieves, stripped of his clothes, left half dead. Now, by chance, what happens? Well, a priest comes dawdling along, and he passes by the guy on the other side. Ooh, there's somebody got some blood coming out over there. I'm staying clear over here. And likewise, a Levite arrived at the place and looked and passed by. I don't want to get involved. But a certain Samaritan came along the journey, and when he saw where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. That's loving our neighbors as we should. What we know the rest of the story. Took him into town, got him a place to stay, got him some medicine. Oh, that's expensive. Will I do a thing like that? Certainly not. Let somebody else deal with that. You see, loving our neighbors goes beyond the waving from afar or hope you get better over there. You see, that's not going to work. That's not loving our neighbors. A third reason is it shows who we belong to. When we look at our neighbors and love them in a way that we should love them, it shows who we belong to. Who do we belong to? Well, Jesus said it this way in Romans chapter 8. There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For to be carnally minded, physical, is death. But to be spiritually minded is life and peace. If you're a Christian, Christ is in you, and you think about things differently than what the world does. It is a different way of looking at it. Verse 8, so then, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. If you're not thinking about things in the right way, if you think about things only in the physical, you cannot please God. But you are in the flesh, you're not in the flesh, but you're in the Spirit. You think about things differently. You have a different approach towards those that you're to love. Now, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is not his. If you claim to be a Christian, you're going to take this idea of loving your neighbor to a different level. It's not going to be hands off, let somebody else deal with it. I'm going to be involved in that. Who does it show that I am? It shows that I have Christ living in me. The average Joe person in the world who's not a Christian looks at their neighbor in a way of afar. It's a hands-off situation. If you're a Christian, you look at it differently. How about you? Are you? Fourth reason is we see Jesus in those who are in need. Do you really? Look at those who are in need as if it were Jesus. Look what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 31. It says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from as he divides as shepherds divide the sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, and thirsty and give you drink, and see you a stranger and take you in, naked and clothe me? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? You weren't in those situations. But what's Jesus say? The king will answer and say to them, assuredly I say to you, insomuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. How we treat others, how we treat our neighbors is a reflection on how you'll treat Jesus. Jesus says you'll see me in those who are in need. You see, a Christian looks at loving his neighbor in a completely different way. And the fifth thing, it does give us opportunity. We have opportunities to help and to be there for people running out your ears. And yet, sometimes we take the afar approach. I don't really want to get involved. I don't really want to help. It's expensive. It's time consuming. It's all these things. And yet, there are opportunities there to help. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 18 says, my little children, let us not love in word or in tongue. We're good at that. I can talk you up a storm, buddy. But now when it comes to doing something, that's a little different. But by the things we know that we are of the truth. And by this we know that they are in the truth, and that shall assure our hearts before him. We do it in deeds and in truth. That's how we show our love for our neighbors. It's not hands off. It's getting involved. Galatians chapter 6 says it this way, let us not grow weary in well-doing. You ever getting tired of helping? Yeah, it gets old once in a while. I'll give you that. He says, don't do that. Don't let that get you down. If you let us not grow weary while doing good. For in due season we'll reap if you don't lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good unto all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. You see, a Christian has a different attitude towards loving his neighbor. He or she will go the extra mile and look for opportunities to help, rather than closing our eyes to it and hoping it goes away. And is he gone yet? Okay. You see what we've done? We have become just like the world when it comes to some of these issues. Stay away. I'm not getting involved. You can forget it. You see, this Lifetime Achievement Award that Fred Rogers won really does speak to loving your neighbors. And it's who are you touching the lives of? of your neighbors? Whose lives are you making an impact on? That is nobody. Then you need to reread loving your neighbor, don't we? If it's people, but it's, I'm not going to get too deep into this, then we really need to reread loving our neighbors. If you're here this morning and not a member of the Lord's church, we certainly give you that opportunity today to do that. Or maybe you're like me at some point in my life where I was just like this. Somebody was in need. I just kind of glossed over that. Somebody else will take care of that. Let somebody else deal with that. I'm not going to get involved. And I didn't really love my neighbor as I should. If you call yourself a Christian, prove it. Start proving it by our deeds. Rather than just running your mouth about what we do and what we don't do, run your mouth, but make appointments and do things in deed, rather than just giving lip service to folks. You'll find opportunities to help folks. And when you find those opportunities to help folks, guess what you'll also find? Opportunities to share the gospel with them. They'll find ways, you'll find ways to find opportunities to share the gospels with folks. If you're here this morning and not a member of the Lord's church, won't you start your journey today as we stand and as we sing?